both of you have mentioned writers that have had influences on you, and I wanted to ask both of you what you feel what legacy do you stand in, and what legacy would you like to leave as writers?
Oh my God, do we ever think about that now?
That's a scary question. Because I don't really think about legacy, although maybe I should. At my age, I know I've recently turned 70, but I still feel like I'm 16 inside. Sometimes I feel 12.
Well, people go into the White House thinking about their legacy. So your contribution, I would imagine, or I can assert, is broader than many of our recent presidents. So I think it's a legitimate question.
It's been kind of surreal, too. I mean, for a long time, every fantasy that came out was compared with Tolkien. Mm-hmm. This is the new Lord of the Rings. This is the heir to Tolkien, et cetera, et cetera. And that was certainly true of my stuff when it came out. People even commented on the RRs and, the fact that we're both RRs. Of course, when we sold it to television, you always have to compare it to that. So it was The Sopranos in Middle-earth. That was how David and Dan sold it to television.
Really?
But now I find myself being the one who's referenced instead of Tolkien. This is the new Game of Thrones. This is the Black Game of Thrones. Or this is here's the new George R. R. Martin. I say, wait a minute, there's a new George R. R. Martin? I wasn't done with being George R. R. Martin yet. And I'm getting, I've gotten a couple awards that are like Lifetime Achievement Awards. And wait a minute, I'm not done achieving. I'm certainly not done with my lifetime. So thinking about legacy and this other stuff is strange. But I think, like every writer, I would like to be remembered. I would like to hope that A Song of Ice and Fire is still being read 50 years from now and 100 years from now, by which time I hopefully will be around in my new robot body and able to enjoy all this acclaim and the continuing royalties that it'll be generating. But if I can influence other writers and help inspire them to do good work, the way people like Tolkien and Robert A. Heinlein and Jack Vance and the other writers who inspired me did, then I'll be very happy with that.
Mm-hmm. I hope I'm a part of this kind of expansion of what is story. I also hope that at some point we look back and chuckle at. Remember when we had this thing called genre, and I mean, growing up in Jamaica, I couldn't afford genre snobbery. I was like, I read whatever book I could steal. I was like, or whatever book I could find or borrow and don't return. And one day that it would be The Railway Children, or it would be Enid Blyton, or it would be Shogun and Taipan, or it would be Sound and the Fury. It's just whatever I could get my hands on, or tons and tons of X-Men and Teen Titans, and just being glad to have something to read, and I think it's something that we need to sort of move from. I get asked about things like cultural appropriation all the time in literature, and I always answer it with a question, which is, how come we don't have this problem with the crime people? How come we don't have this problem with the crime writers? Nearly every writer on The Wire was white. What are the crime writers doing that the literary authors aren't? Well, they don't know because they don't read crime. There are things that there's so many things writers could learn from other writers, and the whole idea of this is a genre that I shouldn't mess with is you deciding this is a kind of intellectual poverty I'm choosing to have, which is fine. Knock yourself out. You just would be one ignorant idiot. But I mean, a lot of stuff I learned about literary fiction I learned from episodes 175 to 200 of X-Men. There are things that I still quote from. I'm like, sooner or later, Chris Claremont is going to come with receipts. It's like, And I nearly missed my own book signing because I was lining up for Mike Mignola. It was crazy because Hellboy rules everything. I just, to me, it's one thing I learned from my teachers is that almost you can learn from nearly anything. And to me, any book is an opportunity for that. And I hope people look at, the stuff I write that way as well, that it was part of that sort of, a way in which we tear down boundaries and barriers and can learn from anything. And
no, the genre is bullshit. And I regret that it's become such a major part of the publishing industry today. When I was a kid in Bayonne, New Jersey, and I started graduating from comic books to books, we couldn't afford a hardcover books. I would take my allowance and I get a 35-cent paperback. But I bought it from a spinner rack, which was right next to the comic book thing, a wire spinner rack. And they didn't have genre sections there. Everything was all mixed together. So I'm looking for a science fiction book, but I have to go through, a couple Mike Hammer books with sexy covers, and then here was a Shakespeare play, and here was Norman Vincent Peale and How to Win Friends and Influence People, nonfiction. Everything was all mixed together. And yeah, I mostly read science fiction and fantasy, but every once in a while something would catch my interest. Oh, here's a historical novel about knights. That looks good. I'll take that. And suddenly I'm reading historical fiction, or I'm reading mystery fiction, or I'm reading a classic of literature because I remember reading the Classics Illustrated comic version, and I like that, so now I'll try the actual Moby Dick. Yeah. And mixing up all of these genres and subcategories and subgenres together, to my mind, was very healthy. But unfortunately, the spinner rack is mostly gone, and now we're going into big bookstores, and it's all divided into section, or we have Amazon, which notices our buying habits and goes up and says, "Here's other books you like, which are exactly like the books that we bought last week." So it's reinforcing narrower and narrower reading things when we should be trying to broaden that. And I wish Amazon would say, here's something you never tried before. Why don't you try that instead of just you bought one book by this author. Here's another book by the same author. Gardner Dozois and I, my dear friend and colleague Gardner Dozois, who died last year, we did a number of deliberately genre-busting anthologies that tried to replicate the spinner rack, but we take a very broad subject like warriors, and we'd invite science fiction writers, mystery writers, mainstream writers, literary writers, romance writers, whatever, and it just write something about a warrior, any time, place, real, imaginary, and we got some great stuff by that, and hopefully introduced readers. They would say, "Oh, Stephen King is in it, I'll buy it for him," and then they would read a story by Joe Lansdale, who they'd never heard of before, or some other writer that they'd never heard of. And the people who bought it for the mystery writers would encounter historical writers, and we love doing that. We're very proud of those anthologies. But we need to get past this categorization of a genre, and some genres are good and bad. It once again, going back to Faulkner, the human heart in conflict with itself. That's what makes a good story, not whether it has a spaceship or a dragon in it, or a gumshoe private eye, or whatever.
I wanted to, speaking of the human heart and thinking about it in a different way, I think you all are in a unique moment with literature and this intersection between literature and what ultimately ends up on television. The Game of Thrones trilogy, right?
Yeah. The trilogy, right?
Trilogy with extra.
The trilogy, right? We were talking right before we came down here about how it's unfolding beyond the book in some ways on television, on pace with you writing.
Right. It's gone beyond me. It's outpaced me.
It's gone beyond. So there's this it takes, to me, an amazing heart to be able to write with that kind of audience peeking over your shoulder, right? The television audience, the literary audience, the Amazon audience that are trying to sell a particular end to the series that's not over yet. Those kinds of concerns are a little different than I think writers 2 generations ago had to deal with. And I wanted to know if you could speak to that experience and what that's been like for you.
Well, it's not entirely comfortable. I mean, in some ways, it's great that so many people were eager for the next book and so many people were invested in it and want to know. But to the extent that I feel the people looking over my shoulder, it slows me down. It troubles me. It's as if somebody was actually peering over my shoulder. You know, when the writing is going well, that vanishes. I mean, when I'm really on a roll, I'm in Westeros. I'm in a scene with you know, whatever character I'm writing about, Dany or Tyrion. I'm inside their skin. I'm looking out through their eyes. I'm seeing who they're seeing and thinking what they're thinking and trying to do it. And there are no editors. There is no TV show. There are no people looking over my shoulder. And I'm not worried about the reception. I'm just trying to say, okay, what would he do then? What would he say now? Oh, how do I describe the scene more vividly to people can picture where he is and where he's standing and you know, whether it's cold or hot or the sensual feelings, all that. I lose myself in the moment. I lose myself in the scene. Anything that takes me out of that in terms of the awareness of the outside world and outside pressures is bad in that sense. On the other hand, it's undoubtedly great that, you know, when the book comes out, that millions and millions of people are eagerly going to rush out and buy it. I mean, obviously that's good. You know, I've been at the other side of that too. I've had a long career, and a lot of people don't quite realize that. But you know, I was writing and publishing novels and short stories for more than 20 years before I even began Game of Thrones, and it's been another 20 years since. But back in the old days, I had my share of doing autograph parties at Walden Books where nobody came, or, you know, you sit there for 3 hours and then someone comes up and you're all eager and they say, where are the cookbooks? Thankfully, that doesn't happen anymore. If anything, I have the opposite problem of too many people come, and I think I'm going to have a stroke after the 4th hour of signing books. You know, it is a strange feeling. It is a strange feeling.